Welcome back to the deep dive. We always love getting into these big questions with you, and this deep dive is no different. We're going to be unpacking a lot of interesting stuff today.
Absolutely. And it's all thanks to you guys sending in such amazing stuff that leads us down these rabbit holes. We got a recent interview that went really deep on some heady topics. We're talking consciousness, death,
Yeah.
and what might, if anything, come next. All that good stuff.
That's right. We're looking at an interview with Clif High, a name some of you might already recognize. He's not afraid to explore some pretty out there ideas.
Definitely not your mainstream thinker. In this interview, he really gets into what he calls his spiritual paradigm, laying out this whole system of thought that challenges a lot of our assumptions.
Right. So our mission today, if you will, is to kind of distill all that down, to pull out those key insights from this pretty expansive interview without, getting totally lost in the weeds.
Exactly. We want to make this as clear and engaging as possible for you. We're looking for those aha moments.
So, to kick things off, let's start with a term that might be new to some folks, metampsychosis. Now, Cliff High isn't using this in some vague philosophical sense. He's talking about actual thought processes continuing after breathing and blood circulation have stopped.
Yeah. And what's interesting is he claims this is already scientifically proven, which, makes you think about all those studies lately on brain activity after clinical death. Is there something more going on there than we realize?
Definitely makes you wonder. Now, historically speaking, there have been many traditions trying to answer these questions. Ancient yogis, Daoist sages, all trying to define that human essence, figure out what, if anything, survives the body.
Right. And they have different methods for approaching this. But the core question was always, does something continue? And if so, what?
And that brings us to the yogic perspective, specifically the teachings attributed to Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras. And I think when many people hear yogi, they imagine someone doing headstands on a mountaintop. But the Yoga Sutras are presented as something much more fundamental than that.
Absolutely. They're not just a philosophical text. They're presented as a very precise guide to the science of yoga, where every word matters. And the goal isn't just physical mastery. It's about understanding the nature of consciousness and reality itself.
And it's interesting that there's even some debate about whether Patanjali was an actual person's name or maybe a title associated with a region, someone from the Pathan region or the Hindu Kush. It goes to show how much gets lost in the mists of time.
That's a great point. We always have to remember how much context we might be missing when we look at these ancient texts. There are a lot of translations and commentaries out there, and the interview recommends looking for those that include the original Sanskrit. But even then, the Yoga Sutras as we have them might be a fragment, a condensed version of a much larger body of knowledge.
A fragment of something that could be over 12,500 years old, potentially predating the last ice age. That's a pretty huge claim.
It is, and the interview even links this to the idea of Proto-Sanskrit and this collector who supposedly found these ancient artifacts with consistent symbols all over the world. The implication being that Sanskrit could be the oldest surviving language and the Yoga Sutras, part of a very ancient and widespread tradition.
Wow, that's a pretty mind-blowing timeline. Okay, so moving on, the interview presents this really interesting model of the human mind, saying we have not one, but 7 different minds operating within us.
Right, you've got your body mind, feeling mind, desire mind, knowledge and reason, and then the thinking mind and the knowing mind. And what's particularly relevant to this idea of metempsychosis is that the thinking mind and the knowing mind are said to exist outside the physical body.
So potentially continuing on even after death. And this is all tied into the idea that consciousness might not fully enter a newborn's body until somewhere between 8 and 18 months, marked by that Y phase kids go through.
It's almost like there's this gradual process of embodiment, right?
Yeah.
Where consciousness slowly integrates with the body while those unconscious biological functions are already running in the background. It begs the question, what is consciousness really, and when does it actually become ours?
Now, this next part might be a little controversial. The interview dives into the definition of the soul. And, what it says might not align with what a lot of people typically think.
Right. It's not about that individual consciousness or our sense of I or a higher self in the usual way we think of it. Instead, it's described as an eon, an autonomous mechanism that's responsible for growing the body based on our parents' DNA. But it also carries all this karmic activity.
So our genes aren't the whole story. The soul is like a second mold, shaping our characteristics beyond just the physical.
Exactly. And the soul is essential for life. It's conscious of its purpose, which is to help the body grow and experience things. But it's not self-aware in the way we are as individuals.
and it enters the mother's body through her breath during pregnancy and then influences the fetus magnetically. It's quite a vivid image.
Really emphasizes that connection between mother and child,
Yeah.
going beyond just the biology. There's also this interesting bit about our first memories. Clif High even shares a personal anecdote about what seems like a memory from before birth.
Which then gets contrasted with the idea that while the soul carries knowledge of gestation, it doesn't bring conscious memories of it. It's a fine point, but it raises some interesting questions.
Now let's talk karma. The soul shows up with all this baggage from past actions, right? And that shapes our experiences in this life. They even talk about the Jain idea of karmans, these spiritual particles that cling to our spiritual body and influence events.
Kind of like a spiritual residue of our past actions. And the soul itself isn't considered immortal in the sense of being indestructible. It's eternal, meaning it has a beginning but no end to its function.
Right, there's a clear distinction made there. And then we get to the experience of metempsychosis itself, what happens at death. The mind and soul separate. The soul goes through this hell experience where it burns off karma, while the consciousness enters this state called heaven.
And get this, all those times you navigated a karmic situation well in life, the soul kind of distills that into intuition for your next life.
Yeah, so intuition is presented as a type of wisdom gained from past successes, and it supposedly gets stronger as the soul matures over many lifetimes.
Makes you think about those gut feelings in a whole new way. And heaven, in this model, isn't a shared experience with others. It's solitary and ongoing, almost like a personal, never-ending lucid dream.
Right, and the interview suggests that many traditions, from yogis and Daoists to shamans, they all develop techniques to glimpse this metempsychosis state.
From deep meditation to the use of psychedelic plants, there's even a specific mention of the moat in one's eye meditation using microdoses of hallucinogens.
Right, the so-called dry way. But there's also the humid way, which is about those slower, more gradual practices. They even mentioned the ancient Greek practice of incubation, this deep stillness practice that could induce similar states without drugs.
It's interesting to think that figures like prophets who brought back knowledge from the other side may have been tapping into this very thing.
That's the suggestion, yeah. And of course, we can't talk about these altered states without talking about the entities people sometimes encounter, like Terence McKenna's machine elves.
Ah, yes, the machine elves.
Yeah.
Now, these beings supposedly lack mayness, that sense of self we have.
Right, and they're connected to the divas in Indian traditions or even fairies. It suggested they're part of the universe's machinery, working behind the scenes for some purpose we might not grasp.
And there's a distinction made between these fifth-order machine elves who have some kind of individuality but no inness, and the Greys, those fourth-order beings who all look alike, maybe sharing a soul like insects.
And Clif High shares a pretty wild story about meeting these machine elves in the form of garden gnomes during a meditation related to his dying brother. This whole interaction gets linked to the magician prerogative in magical traditions, the idea of asserting your will in these non-ordinary realms.
Interesting stuff. Now, let's be clear about the distinction made in the interview between reincarnation and transmigration, this idea of humans being reborn as animals.
Right, Clif High strongly disagrees with transmigration. He sees evolution as primarily upward, although becoming unhuman from a human state is seen as extremely difficult. The focus is on spiritual masters achieving transhuman states, becoming like gods, and an example of that upward movement.
The interview uses the example of Hitler reincarnated as a Jewish dog to illustrate why transmigration is seen as problematic. The focus is on that yogic and Daoist idea of 82 million lives before even reaching human form, suggesting a very long process of learning and development.
Yeah, it raises the question of how souls designed for human existence could end up in lower forms if transmigration was the norm. And the interview also gets into that period between lives, that deep sleep or big rest for rejuvenation.
And it talks about how children with past life memories might have shorter lifespans before those memories resurface, and how those memories fade as they accumulate new karma.
They also observe that in some cases of child reincarnation, there's this geographical and cultural proximity, suggesting these might be incomplete incarnations. And they challenge the idea of someone like Hitler being quickly reborn, given all the energy focused on him.
Which leads to this pretty wild idea, right? That certain elites are engaged in a war across time, trying to stop unfavorable individuals from reincarnating quickly, even using Obama's visit to Egyptian statues as a potential example.
Yeah, that's where we start getting into some pretty fringe territory. And cremation is favored in the interview because it releases the soul from the hold of the body in hell, as opposed to practices that might harm consciousness. They also mention the Hindu tradition of natural decomposition as another option, and the whole concept of constant atomic turnover in the body is brought up to challenge that purely materialist view of the self.
Right, we're not just our physical matter. So let's get back to this idea of Inus, that fundamental sense of being you. How does the interview define it?
So Inus is that point where the thinker mind and the knower mind fuse. And importantly, it's not bound to the body. It can be experienced independently, like when you wake up and instantly know you're you. Everyone experiences Inus, even if materialists explain differently. And your consciousness attached to that Ininess can be diluted by things, but not destroyed.
So all that talk about expanding consciousness or ascending is kind of debunked in this paradigm.
Exactly. And it's important to note that when yogis and Daoists talk about consciousness, they're often referring to Purusha, which is this blending with the soul. That can get confusing because it's different from how we typically use those terms.
Right, we have to be careful about the language here. Now, the interview keeps coming back to karma, saying it creates these predictable patterns in our lives, even if materialists observe them without understanding the root cause.
And those patterns continue until the soul burns off that karma. And that separation of mind and soul during metempsychosis is emphasized again, leading to this feeling of freedom.
There's also this hierarchy of energy presented, right? Where E-ness, our consciousness, is the most refined, then the soul, and lastly, the more condensed energy of physical matter. And they talk about the universal face people see in enlightenment being surprisingly similar to their own face, reflected across these infinite spheres.
Yeah, some really trippy imagery there. And the interview presents this idea of a complete cycle of incarnations with 6 male and 6 female lifetimes, usually alternating. And transgenderism is seen as a potential bleed-through of energies from the next life, where the soul is preparing for its next gender.
So almost like a pre-echo of your next incarnation. And the interview gets into the hormonal basis of desire and feeling, locating them in the pancreas, which is also where consciousness supposedly attaches.
They even use this wild example of a head transplant to illustrate that idea. And while there's been historical speculation about the soul residing in the hypothalamus, or the pineal gland, or even the vagus nerve, the interview emphasizes the pancreas as that connection point for consciousness when you return from out-of-body experiences.
Of course, the idea of transferring consciousness into machines is critiqued within this framework.
Definitely not compatible with this model. Now, they address a listener's affinity for ancient Rome, suggesting it could be a past life connection. And while details from past lives are generally inaccessible, they don't rule out the possibility of finding external evidence in historical records or artifacts.
Then we get into some really eyebrow-raising stuff, right? Claims about elites trying to manipulate reincarnation.
The interview talks about this alleged project by a U.S. defense subcontractor digitizing old images with facial recognition to identify the past lives of certain elite individuals. The goal being to game the system and control future incarnations as part of this war through time.
And they mention ancient tantric practices like sexual yoga and semen retention as attempts to manipulate the reincarnation cycle, associated with black magic and karmic consequences.
Yeah, some pretty heavy stuff. Now, the whole purpose of physical existence and reincarnation is presented as being about progress, which requires us not to know about future lives. Wanting to control karma is seen as a negative attachment, like Gollum and the Ring.
A good analogy. They advocate for this harmonious approach to life, where you can accelerate natural processes, but not in a way that creates negative karma.
Right, it's about working with the natural flow of things. And while our desires and feelings driven by karma can lead to unavoidable outcomes, the interview emphasizes the importance of making conscious choices, whether to deny, face, or live your destiny.
And they highlight the value of meditation and yogic or Daoist practices for self-awareness and the bodhisattva ideal of seeking enlightenment for the benefit of all.
The concept of avatars and adepts returning to help humanity is also brought up, emphasizing our interconnectedness and the benefits of collective progress.
Now, the length of that deep sleep between lives is supposedly tied to the intensity of your past life. So someone like Clif High, who's had a very active life, might have a longer rest period.
Interesting. And they mentioned those attempts to mathematically predict reincarnation timing, like in Jainism, which elites are supposedly interested in for their war through time.
The existence of patterns in reincarnation is acknowledged, but they caution against seeing patterns where there are none, which is a very human tendency.
We love finding patterns. Now, they address the potential concern that a solitary heaven might feel like hell, explaining that it's filled with a gap, this all-encompassing love.
And that the connections from past lives are preserved within your experience there, even if those people aren't currently incarnate.
It's like carrying those memories with you.
Yeah.
And they clarify that time in metempsychosis isn't linear like we experience it. So previous lives is a concept tied to our calendar, but it could be more simultaneous from a higher perspective.
Like touching base at the center of a circle of space-time. And they even entertain the possibility of reincarnation on other planets, guided by similar principles of progress.
Right, not limiting this to just Earth. And they mention that ancient idea of the spirit returning to the sun and possible membranes at the edges of our solar system.
They even bring up the Jain cosmology with its 2.5 inhabited islands in our solar system, Mars, the Moon, and Earth, with a much larger population in the past, putting our current numbers in perspective.
Yeah, you might not be as unique as we think. Now, soulmates are addressed too, referencing the Masonic idea of two pillars fusing, which is interpreted allegorically as spiritual progress, not literal fusion.
They also propose the possibility of a shared Inus among a group of 12 souls, leading to those strong attractions or repulsions we sometimes feel, and even overlapping incarnations where multiple bodies could share the same Inus without knowing it.
That's a wild thought. And collective karma is explained, how it operates in both physical and energetic bodies, leading to shared destinies, like those infants born into a war zone.
Right, there's this interconnectedness at play. And the interview touches on those modern transhumanist ideas of dissolving souls and preventing reincarnation through energy manipulation.
As well as historical attempts like that papal curse on Jacques de Molay, trying to stop his rebirth through trauma.
Yeah, some pretty dark stuff there. And they debunk the idea of souls splitting or fusing, saying it's a misunderstanding based on a materialist view of quantity versus quality.
The focus is on the richness of the individual coffee bean, the soul and its inniness, leading to wisdom and enlightenment.
And they circle back to those attempts to mathematically predict reincarnation timing, which elites are interested in, but caution against seeing patterns that might not be real.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, drawing on ancient philosophies, esoteric traditions, and some pretty unconventional modern interpretations.
And we focused on the practical implications of all this, not just the spiritual or religious aspects.
And that leads us to a final thought for you, our listener. Given this cyclical view of time and experience, this seemingly endless cycle of metempsychosis and reincarnation, what does it all mean for the significance, or maybe the insignificance, of any single moment, any single lifetime? It's a big question, and we encourage you to explore it further, dive back into your own sources with these new ideas in mind.
And see where it takes you. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Until next time.